goals help you execute in the year for the year about the metrics and the milestones you want to hit on your journey to that future state. And so I would say goals are your strategy execution element, but you can't execute strategy if you don't have a strategy. So we need goals because that's how things happen, but we need a strategy so we make sure the right things are happening.
Welcome to another episode of the Upflip podcast. I'm your host, Alex Freeman, and today we have Erica J. Olsen, CEO and founder of OnStrategy HQ, to discuss strategic business planning. Erica J. Olsen and her family started OnStrategy HQ to help clients plan and implement business strategies with their software and consulting. In this interview, we'll talk to Erica, CEO and co-founder of the 15-year-old strategy and organizational performance SaaS and consulting business. They found a niche between the major consulting firms and sole proprietors that has helped companies and governments achieve higher success. She'll share her expert advice, how to create strategies that lead to business or project success, and tips that every business owner should know to keep their business following their strategic plan. You don't want to miss this podcast. It will change your life. Erica, to kick things off, thanks for joining us.
So nice to be here, Alex. And I look forward to sharing tips and advice.
Awesome. I'd love to just kind of kick things off with your background. How did you come to your expertise in strategic business planning?
Such a great question. I'd love to say that it was intentional because business planning is super intentional, but it was a bit accidental. I was working during the dot-com boom, the first one, doing a lot of business planning, actual startup business planning. And I decided that there's a lot of existing businesses that needed business planning, which we would call strategic planning, planning for the future for existing concerns. And that just turned into a life's work. And I like to think about the Malcolm Gladwell rule of expertise of 10,000 hours. And I would say I'm getting close to the 10,000 hours of mastering the craft of facilitating and managing strategy, planning, and execution.
And when we talk about strategic business planning, what are the objectives? What should a business hope to achieve by going forth into this strategic planning process?
Yeah, another great question. I think that strategic business planning or strategic planning kind of gets a bad rap because a lot of times people have the experience of the process being really long and laborious and not super fruitful. And so starting with the end in mind would be being really, really clear about what this process and this business practice will do for you. And my headline for all of our listeners would be to say, if there is a place in the future that is different than today, a place that you envision for your business or your team that's different than today, then that's the purpose of doing a strategic business plan. The outcome should be to journey and roadmap that path from our current state to that future state. And that would be the best and highest use of a good business planning process.
So, to me, it sounds that strategic planning is important in understanding where you're trying to go with your business. And how does that relate to the business's vision and or mission statement?
Strategic planning tends to masquerade as a lot of different things. And one thing's for sure, when we think about strategic planning or business planning, we think about mission and vision. And we tend to think about those as like debatable points. And so I would say again to all of our listeners, great strategic plans absolutely have an answer to the question why an organization exists, which is a mission statement, and very much paints the picture of the future, as I mentioned before. And we would call that a vision statement. They are different. They do different things in your strategic plan. They answer different business questions. And it's super, super important to have clarity around those two pieces. I would say clarity matters more than the perfect set of words that sometimes we get a bit tripped up in when we think about mission and vision statements.
And could you really lay out for our listeners the benefits, really do a pro-con analysis of strategic analysis, really more what are the pros of doing it and what are the problems you'll run into if you don't?
Yeah. So let's see. Okay, right. So the pros of doing it would be to say you've established a management practice. It is, at the end of the day, it's a management tool. It's a way that we should lead and drive decision-making for organizations. So having a plan, having something on paper that says where we're going and why, the benefit to that is your team, your customers, if They'll feel the impact of it. They probably don't know your plan. Your leadership, your board, all are aligned on what the priorities are and what they're not, and the path to that future state that I mentioned before, right? So that's like the benefit. I think the other benefit, by the way, particularly now, staff want to be connected to something bigger. And you need to have an answer to that something bigger if you're leading an organization. So that's a huge benefit. A con would be you did it, sits on the shelf, you don't use it to drive decisions, and ultimately it's not relevant to your current state of existence because things have changed. And when that happens, then the plan is just, it's not even worth the ink that's on the paper. So that would be the con of doing a strategic plan, a strategic business plan, and not using it.
I kind of want to dial into that change thing because, it feels like in the last 2 years, every couple weeks or so, the entire business landscape has just been flipped on its head. And so how does a company find their footing in this kind of environment?
I think the foundational elements of a strategic plan are important no matter what. Where we get sideways is when the execution layer is no longer relevant to the chaos that's in your current environment. And to acknowledge and to address that means we're not doing a strategic plan as an event. We are doing strategic planning as a process. And the way that we make it a process is we connect in and we adapt and we modify on a monthly or quarterly basis, not an annual basis. So that's just a really big tip I want to share with your listeners, which is let's think about strategic planning as a practice. And we make it a practice by making it part of your cadence monthly and quarterly, not just annually. And that's how you stay relevant to the chaos and make the tool work.
I love all of that. Our next couple of questions are coming from one of our viewers on our YouTube channel. This is our fan blitz question. They come from that YouTube channel. If you want to check out Upflip on YouTube, please make sure you do. Life of Caden is asking, what's the difference between your way to approach strategy coaching compared to a business coach or other strategy organizations?
The work of strategic planning and the work that we do as my team does as facilitators and process leaders of a strategic planning and performance management process is that we are guiding and leading the strategic decision making for the business that is about the work. A business coach, on the other hand, is actually coaching how we do the work and how staff, leaders, and managers approach and work together as a team to do the work. And as facilitators and as strategists and strategic planners, that's not really our expertise. While this process has a lot of human dynamic, most of the time we don't delve into the how the work gets done from a human dynamic perspective and a organizational structure perspective. That would be what business coaches are much better at and make their lives work in.
Life of Caden asked also the perfect follow-up question here is, how do your strategies differ from when you're working with a startup business to a larger one?
I would answer that in two ways. And a startup is arguably smaller than a larger organization, and engaging everybody in air quotes in the initial planning process is super important. And by everybody, I do mean let's make sure that the team's DNA is in the mix. And so for a small organization, that means they're actually part of the planning process, if you can be that broad base with it. And for a larger organization, that means we engage everyone through asynchronous engagement, AKA surveys, maybe mural boards, that type of thing. And they don't necessarily get to be in the room. On the execution side, after the strategy has been developed, I would argue that the engagement of everybody in executing the plan is quite a bit more complicated and robust. And everybody loves using OKRs right now to do that. And for to lay out that acronym, that would be objectives and key results. And so, for a larger organization, that's a great way to execute the strategy and do a bottoms up engagement with the plan. In a smaller organization, you don't need to go to that level and degree. You can own pieces of the plan by establishing KPIs and initiatives, and it doesn't need to be quite so spread through the organization because the team is smaller. So that would be my answer to the question on how the planning processes are different.
Thank you for that. And also thank you to Life of Caden for sending in those questions via our YouTube channel. Again, check out Upflip on YouTube and post your questions in the comments there, and we'll bring them into a future show. Now, in terms of business leadership, what are the key behaviors or traits of a strategic leader, and what factors or skills make someone excel at leading strategically?
Yeah, as leaders, we all hope and believe that we are leading strategically, right? That's just this aspiration that I think every leader has. And I think we're all striving to do that better. And we should continue to do so. I would say it's super multidisciplinary. And the best leaders that I work with are able to toggle from the big picture, from that big vision, because ultimately, only the leader can lay out that big vision. And that's a big deal. Strategic leadership also means that you can get into the details because visions don't get executed by staying at the treetops. You have to get down to the roots. So you need to understand how execution happens, what the KPIs mean that you're using to assess your performance. And arguably, great strategic leadership uses the strategy and strategies that have been set forth to drive decisions. And, decisions mean we're making choices. And strategic leadership is about making choices. And a lot of times we don't want to do that because choices means we're cutting off options. And I would say to all of us as strategic leaders and striving to be strategic leaders, strategic planning and leading strategically, it's a hypothesis. We don't know the future, but you are trying to create the future through your planning and through your knowledge and your expertise. And ultimately, it's up to you to decide where you're going and why and lead your team there. And that can be a little nervy and a little uncomfortable, but that's the work.
And how does a business owner develop those skills? Certainly people start their business because they're either really good at doing something or they are a very strong visionary leader, and often they have to develop a skill that goes the other way. How does somebody go about doing that?
One way to do that, I think, is to start maybe with a strategic initiative. So sometimes we think about strategic business planning or strategic planning. We are planning for the whole organization, and that can be kind of daunting. So maybe taking a bite-sized approach would be to take a strategic initiative, something that you're trying to create new in your organization, and try on the principles that are strategic planning, performance management, and use it in a more contained, smaller approach. And that will allow you to learn more rapidly about what works for you and what doesn't work for you as a leader.
And then how about the filling out the rest of their team? Like, how do you hire the right people to support your strategic business plan?
Yeah, strategic planning, like I mentioned before, so multidisciplinary. So it touches the HR aspect, it touches finance, it touches operations, it touches, whatever your product development process is. And when it comes down to people, everything is about, the right people in the right spot on the bus. And I feel like there is a really awesome approach to this. I am not an expert organizational designer. However, I facilitate a lot of strategic planning processes, and key pieces of those processes are, hey, we just built this whole plan. Let's also lay in the organizational chart and the capabilities and the resources we need to execute against the plan. There is a great exercise, a great facilitated exercise in the book called Powerful. Your listeners may have checked it out, but check it out because there's several pages on facilitating your own process for envisioning that future of people and capabilities. And I would do it a disservice if I tried to summarize it right now, but it's great and highly recommend it. And that will really help you snap in that section of your plan in terms of what your team needs to look like.
And then how does this all relate to goal setting? Does the strategic plan need to have an end goal? Does goal setting necessarily equate to a strategic plan? How does that all relate to each other?
Also, another one of my favorite topics. So, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, one of the things that we're calling goals today are objectives and key results, or OKRs. And that particular acronym has just taken off like wildfire. And OKRs are really goals. And one of the challenges with just doing goal setting, just as goal setting in and of itself, is that sometimes that masquerades as strategy. And OKRs and goal setting is not strategic planning in and of itself. It is a piece of strategic planning, but it is not the start and stop of it. So my first really big tip I would just say, hey, don't just do OKRs, don't just do goal setting. Make sure that you have an overarching strategy and kind of think too, strategic planning does not have to take 6 months or 3 months. It can be rapid, it can be quick, it can be agile. You absolutely have got to have an overall direction for your organization and an answer to the question where you're going and why, as I mentioned before. And then the goals help you execute in the year for the year about the metrics and the milestones you want to hit on your journey to that future state. And so I would say goals and OKRs are your strategy execution element, but you can't execute strategy if you don't have a strategy. So we need goals because that's how things happen, but we need a strategy so we make sure the right things are happening.
And what if a business leader doesn't know what their goals are? How can they identify what they should be shooting for? My assessment is that that's more a company that maybe has been, they built up a good business and it's just kind of trucking along, not expanding necessarily. But how do they identify what their new goals should be?
That is also one of those interesting questions in terms of, gosh, where do you just dig in? And so a suggestion I might make would be the input or the raw material for what should we be working on and where should we go. If you're really sitting in a place with your business, like, I'm the leader and I'm supposed to set a vision and the future is kind of unclear. I don't feel comfortable doing that. I would suggest doing for lack of a better word, like a data call and getting some feedback from your staff. Sure, a staff survey. You can do it in other more interactive ways. Customers, sure, we could do a customer survey or, again, other cool interactive ways. Doing a light competitive analysis to see what's going on in your marketplace and a light review of maybe mega trends. And what I'm saying kind of in those dimensions is to say, maybe go fishing for what's going on out there and pull all that information together with you and your leadership team and organize it in a manner that starts to tell you where the market's going and how you might position yourself in the market. That might help you with your vision, what your customers are asking for, what your staff is asking for, where your competitors are taking share, and that will help you with your goal setting. And so it can be daunting to jump on this path if you kind of really are unsure where you should go. And that would be my suggestion. That will help you start to frame up what a plan might look like, what goals might look like.
And once they've kind of done that goal setting and some of that initial research to help them goal set, is there other homework that they need to be doing or self-analysis to handle before they start writing their strategic plan?
That's always one of those things. It's like, how much data do we need in order to do a good job in planning? And that's a place that can really elongate a planning process. And then conversely, if you don't have data, and that's, it's a big word, as we know, if you don't have data, you're being a little sort of just self-reflective. And while that can be good, oftentimes that's not enough. So my counsel would be to say, look, make sure that you have enough data in front of you so you're not navel gazing, you're not just, talking to yourselves, but don't overdo it so that you're creating a process that's just like it's going to buckle under its own weight. Okay, so that's one piece. So then what data might you go get that would be lightweight and helpful? If you're lucky enough to have an industry association that benchmarks you, you're in the money, that's going to give you tons of great data. A lot of people don't have that, or you just don't think the benchmarks are relevant. Your industry reporting can be really helpful to help pull in from, again, free information from your industry, what's going on in terms of mega trends and threats and all that good stuff. And then honestly, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 to buy some research can be really helpful as well. I kind of subscribe to the school of thought of good, lightweight, practical, impactful. So, kind of with those philosophies in our planning process, I like to be able to grab data quickly and easily. And those are some of the places that I go to with my clients just to get some good data on the table, but not overdo it.
On that note, in the terms of especially like competitor analysis, do you have any particular tools or strategies to kind of get that lightweight data to really start working with?
Competitive data to buy it can be expensive. I feel like there's a lot of information that can be garnered just from doing basic Google research. And so places to go get stuff, of course, on your competitors would be actually their sites. And, create a little matrix on what are their strengths. What do you think their strengths are? What do you think their weaknesses are? What do you think their competitive advantages are? Where do you think they're going? That's kind of a really interesting question. Yes, we're guessing, but okay. So obviously your industry reporting, their social channels are super insightful, of course. And then of course their they're just their primary websites, and also your sales team. So that's a great way to get a view of what might be happening with your competitors that, is sitting in people's brains, but might not be on paper. So that's not perfect, right? Because that's not all objective, but it's going to get you close enough to start to frame up what the competitive landscape might look like.
And I would assume that that's also something that one should kind of be, on a constant rotation of checking out their competitors. And what would the timing of that be? Is that quarterly? Is that monthly? How often should somebody be doing that kind of analysis?
I think it matters how fast your industry is moving. So our industry right now, oddly enough, is moving very fast. So we were only doing it once every 6 months, and like for our own business. And we just started doing it quarterly because things are going so fast. You might be in an industry that's not moving fast, and once a year is totally sufficient.
How can a business assess their own resources and capabilities to make sure they're utilizing all of their strengths and advantages?
I think that the honest place to get a reflection on one's own resources and capabilities is your staff perspective is always invaluable. And I feel like we often fall back on doing employee satisfaction when we think about surveys. And I'm not saying that. I'm saying actually getting staff input around resources and capabilities in the context of the plan and where you're trying to go. So that's kind of a different way to engage your team. I think also our customers tell us a lot as well. So, but to the point that you were asking earlier, we only know that we're leveraging our resources and capabilities if we have uncovered in a thorough way the needs and expectations of our customers and clients. And we've mapped that to how well we're delivering against that value. And we're doing that in a really honest way. It's all about creating that value for our clients and our customers, and how we map that up starts with understanding if, what those needs are, and honest to goodness, how we're doing against them.
And to kind of flip that around, is it the same kind of process to evaluate obstacles and threats? Is it that same kind of data gathering, or are there other tools that someone should use to identify and mitigate potential risks?
I would say that's the same as well. Honestly, when I ask and when we have that conversation with our clients about risks, until the pandemic, most of the time, nobody wanted to talk about risks or threats. Like we just kind of blew it off. And now we're living in an environment where it's really real, right? Inflation's really real. The Great Resignation's really real. Labor shortages are real. And so when we think about the top 5 or 6 major threats to a business, your executive team probably knows. And even just having a really direct and structured conversation to identify those risks and your mitigation, that's head and shoulders beyond what a lot of things, often what I see in work that I do with our clients. So that in and of itself would be great to do, and probably sufficient.
And then are there other tools or software that we haven't touched on yet that you might recommend business leaders to invest in for strategic planning?
So I think about strategic planning in a couple different buckets. So there's the strategy work. So the work of creating where are we going and why, where to play, how to win. And so that is the creative process of, we've got a bunch of data, survey tools help with that. Straight up talking to people helps with that. Buying research helps with that. Taking all that information and making sense of it, organizing it, and turning it into something to execute against. So everybody, of course, I still love it. Everybody's loving Mural or Miro as our, virtual whiteboards, virtual workspaces to help, essentially throw everything up on the wall and start to turn it into something. Certainly, everybody's a lot of times are going back to doing that work in person, of course. We've got our sticky notes and flip charts and whiteboards, totally cool. But, Mural and Miro have done a great job. So that's kind of in the building the strategy and then translating that into goals and OKRs, doing that in Mural or on whiteboards or whatever, that's fine. But using software for that does help. We have an app that we, as Alex, you mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of OKR applications out there. And again, OKRs, goals, they're to some degree different in the way that the execution is approached, but the actual use of them to execute strategy, engage teams in pieces that they own and report on progress, I would absolutely recommend using an application to manage the execution. And then, as I mentioned before, if we're going to be agile, we're reporting on our progress and we're adapting as we go, at least quarterly. So by having your plan in an app, that allows you to be more agile and adapt, defer stuff, add stuff, etc. So that would be my suite of software that I would recommend to enable and automate what you can for your strategy planning and execution.
So once a leader and or the executive team of a business has their plan put together, how do they then communicate it to the wider business? Is there a certain timing? Is there a certain way that they should communicate that strategic plan to give them the best chance at achieving those goals and, I suppose, achieving buy-in from the rest of the company?
Yep. It's fascinating. A lot of times we do such a good job in the planning process, going through all the different groups, engaging everybody, boards, staff, etc., all the stuff we talked about, customers, great. And then it comes back around, the plan's done, and we're kind of exhausted. It's hilarious. It happens all the time, right? We're like done with it. And the most important part is that, close the loop and roll out the plan and communicate it and engage everybody in, now we're moving into the most important part, which is, the execution and your piece of being part of moving this organization forward. So one super simple thing that I love and everybody loves is having a one-page plan. That is a great communication tool. You can make it look really fancy, or you can really just have a one-page plan. I would highly recommend that you have a one-page plan that you share with your organization. The caveat to that would be concerns related to confidentiality. So if you're concerned about that because it is shared, you need to balance that with giving somebody the plan in their hands. There's some ways to sanitize plans, so think about that too. I would push you, our listeners, to think about how can you enable and provide a one-page plan that is clear and concise, but not oversharing, but achieves the goal of getting everybody engaged. So that's that. And then for sure, at least on a quarterly basis, I would absolutely share where are we on our journey against our goals and KPIs for the year. That looks like a quarterly strategy review. That could look like an all-company meeting. There's a lot of different ways to do it. It's not only important to communicate where you're going and why and point the direction, which is your North Star, but to consistently and religiously let your team know where they are on the journey to that future state. If you do that, you'll do a great job keeping your staff engaged on your path and in your strategic plan.
And then can you also just lay out outside of the company, in terms of employees and other members of the executive team, you have other stakeholders often, whether that's business partners or investors. At what point do you bring them into the conversation around strategic planning, and what's the best way to initiate those conversations?
Yeah, also super important. So we haven't really touched on that. But as far as investors and boards go, I didn't mention them as a stakeholder group at the beginning of a planning process, but let's agree that they're really important. Two groups to engage at the beginning of a process to make sure that the expectations that they have for the business are clearly, on the table as you're building your plan. In fact, in one of my recent engagements, we made a little bit of a mistake by not having one of the investors' expectations as clearly in front of us as we should have. And quite frankly, that expectation pointed the way, and we built a plan in the wrong direction. So don't do that. So that's one thing not to do. So we prevent that by getting their voice at the beginning of the process. Awesome. And then arguably, a strategic plan is almost like an agreement between an executive team and a board and investors around what the priorities are, what the goals are, what we're doing, what we're not doing, and why. And as you're communicating to your staff the progress of the plan against the plan, so also should that same information go to your board and your investors, maybe a little summarized, And I would say it would be the same cadence, just like we said before about quarterly communication to your staff. I would do the same thing to the board.
I think there's a lot about businesses as well that can make a plan really well. They can implement at the beginning really well. And then the next point of failure is long term. It kind of just falls apart. They get off track, they get off path. From a day-to-day perspective, what can and should they be doing to prevent that long-term failure?
Our best clients are those clients that establish and or have brought on board in their minds that strategic planning and organizational performance, and you hear me use different words, but it's all that same stuff, is a business practice, like I mentioned maybe at the beginning of our discussion. And when we make it a big business practice, it is the rhythm of the business. And the rhythm of the business is on a monthly basis, we report on our progress and we talk about it with the executive team. And on a quarterly basis, we share it with our staff and our board. That's like simple, right? And when we establish that cadence and when we make that part of the rhythm of the business, then, and we don't change it, like we don't change it. And the leaders that I work with that just don't change that, they just don't get bored with that rhythm, are the most successful in keeping the focus on the strategic plan and the strategic direction of an organization. So I would say the way that you keep the tyranny of the day-to-day from eating the future direction that you're trying to go is that nexus of every month, every quarter, we talk about strategically what we're doing to move the business forward. The last thing I'll say about that, though, is strategy is about creating the future, but the work happens in the day-to-day and the work happens in the operational. And that, strategy and operations are not like, one's good and one's bad, one's more important, one's not. They're co-equally important, but it's easier to talk about the day-to-day than it is about the future. So the strategic planning process and that rhythm of monthly and quarterly keeps you talking about strategy and keeps you talking about the future. And that's the magic of that consistency.
Yeah. No, I mean, I want to get about 4 things you said in there stitched on a pillow just to always remember them because I think they're so important. On that long-term accountability aspect, what can business leaders be doing to hold themselves accountable? How does that process differ for somebody that's, maybe running a company of themselves or a company of 4 employees versus someone that is running a, major corporation with 500 to 1,000 plus employees?
Yep. I think on that bigger organizational size, often the board is that accountability. I think that is also the role of a business coach. And so that's a really great way to have a non-binding, I would say, board accountability is pretty binding. Also, what's interesting is when you have to stand up and talk about the performance of your organization to your staff, quarterly or monthly, you are by default creating peer accountability and quite frankly, actually bottom-up accountability. And that's really, really powerful. And then on the smaller organizational size, I think boards of advisors are awesome. And I think business coaches serve that same process as well.
And you've made a lot of mention of that quarterly reporting, that making sure everybody stays on the same page of understanding what the OKRs and the KPIs, are we hitting these numbers that we need to be hitting as we go along? But on that, as you're making those evaluations, how do you know if the plan is succeeding? Or I guess the flip side of that question, at what point do you say, oh, we're missing and we need to make an adjustment, or we're missing and we just need to give this a little more time?
Yeah, boy, that is the creative process of all of this, right? I mean, I think one easy answer to that, it's the wrong answer, but it's the easy answer, is your financial results. And let's agree, for nonprofits and for businesses, as much as we don't want it to be the case, it is about the financial results. We want the triple bottom line, absolutely, but we still absolutely have to, write paychecks every 2 weeks. So the problem with that as being do we adapt our strategy, do we wait, or do we need to make a change, is that is a lagging indicator. And because it's a lagging indicator, it's too late. It's not I guess it's never too late, but it's too late. And so a suggestion I would have is to really think about those handful of leading indicators, those warning buoys that are those metrics that very much tell you, and because of the business you're running, if those start to fail, or start to falter, that you need to make an adaptation. And maybe not like a massive change, but certainly an adaptation.
Is this also a spot that an outside consultant can play a really key part, especially if you're a younger company and or a younger leader who maybe doesn't have quite the depth of experience of evaluating those things? Is that one of the advantages of bringing in that outside help?
And we have not talked about that up till now, but that's a great point, Alex. And I think that outside help is most relevant when that outside help does have deep industry expertise in your industry, in your business. And a lot of times we push back on that because we say, well, my business is a little different. It's not quite the same. I wouldn't go about it that way. So as long as you've got a trusted advisor like that you really feel has been there, done that, I think that's a great use of an outside consultant. Absolutely.
And then collecting a lot of feedback is both part of the planning process, is part of the ongoing understanding if the strategy is working process. How does a business go about collecting all of that feedback and data from employees and customers and then processing through that data?
So absolutely, the feedback from employees and customers would be part of that primary data, that original data that helps you know whether your new strategy, new product, new service, market entry is actually working and succeeding. I do think it just takes hard work. Of course, we have all of the great tools on the customer survey side of things, actual behavioral data, that type of stuff, if you're running that kind of a business. But I actually think committing to a robust, regular set of feedback from your customers is just something that we don't do great as businesses most of the time. And whatever that process, tool, and cadence looks like for you, I think just committing to it and doing it goes a long way. On the staff side, one of my favorite tools right now, and they're not a customer of ours, we just use it, is Office Vibe. I feel like that tool has changed the way that you can collect feedback from your staff without having to do an annual or semi-annual employee survey, which just feels so laborious and not agile. So it's AI driven, it's much more rapid, much more automated, and really engaging. And so check it out, by the way, it's really cool. But that's a way to think about keeping that data coming to you without having to turn it into this massive initiative. So Office Vibe has cracked it from a staff side. The customer side is just hard work. And it's good hard work, but it's hard work.
And then what does the process look like for revising your strategic plan? Is there if you're making quarterly reports, is that a quarterly review and revision process, or is it an as needed process? And how do you decide it's needed?
Yep. So if we're thinking about kind of back to that cadence and back to that practice, a little flip on the strategic planning process, if you will, that we all know from business school days, would be to think about the process, like I said, not just annually, but like more agilely. And that would be quarterly, right? And so how does that look? So a quarterly review with your executive team, pushing yourself to think about that as 20% of the time looking back and 80% of the time looking forward. That would be the time to help you think about whether you need to change and adapt your plan, refresh it, plan forward, that type of thing. So what's the problem with that? The problem with that is the budgeting process doesn't allow for that. So certainly once a year, you've got to do a full refresh and align your plan with your budget, just because budgets are annually. But back to the point about not waiting once a year to do that, lightly doing that once a quarter by thinking about those quarterly reviews, not just being a review, but also being a refresh.
And then what happens if the plan fails? How does somebody recover and refocus after a bad planning decision?
Wow, business is made up of failures, right? Little failures, big failures, daily failures. I think we should allow for the fact that a chunk of the plan should fail and will fail. And maybe it's not failing like big F, but rather because you're thinking about your planning as a bit more agile, a bit more connected, you're ahead of it. So you stop investing resources before that strategy has levied the decision that it's, being cut. And normally there is not a light switch in businesses it's often like a slow progress or a slow decline. And so with that in mind, if you are leading strategically, because you will be, and you are running an agile process, so you have this practice in place where it's just how you run your business, then it's not a spectacular fail that you're looking at. It's a course correction because you've already decided, or you've got the metrics to help you know that you're not heading in the right direction. So that would be my suggestion, is just to say, if we think about being more connected with execution, then the failure is a little bit less intense because we caught it earlier.
And what are some of the most common mistakes you see businesses making when it comes to their strategic planning?
Oh boy, I have a list, so I'll keep it short. But I shared a couple of them. One is that we think we have this old school thinking that it's a 6 or 3 month process. So that needs to stop. None of us have time for that. The world's marched on by the time you're done with that kind of exercise. I am not saying don't be thorough. And I am not saying that you just make shortcuts. I am saying get to execution, start trying things out, start getting results on the books, on the table, so to speak, so you can adapt and adjust and refine and make it part of the conversation as opposed to, like I said before, an event. So that's one thing, right? This elongated process. The other thing is we get really tripped up in needing a perfect plan. And, perfection is the enemy of good in this case. 80% is good enough. It really is. You got to start moving and start seeing if your hypotheses are proving out. The other thing that is a huge pitfall is over planning. And there's a couple of ways that we over plan. We plan too far into the organization without those people building upward to the strategy. So don't do that. And then the third thing is that we are just adding, it's just the plan's just too big. We've put everything in the kitchen sink in the plan, and you don't need to do that. Strategic planning is about creating the future. And so let's focus on the critical things that are moving your business to that future state. It doesn't need to be every single thing that your organization does. And my last thing would be to say, it can't be strategic planning if there isn't strategy. And strategy is answered by where to play, how to win. So that's, of course, relevant for businesses, not for governments, but it's relevant for nonprofits too. Where are we going to play? How are we going to win? And if we haven't answered those questions, we do not have a strategy and you do not have a strategic plan.
Yeah, that is something I do want to get into a little bit here with you and give you an opportunity to speak about how far out should we be making these strategic plans? Is this, a 3 years, 5 years? People love to tout their 15, 20, 30-year plans. Or is this, 5 months? The world changes rapidly. So how far out should somebody be thinking in that regard?
That question is like the other questions today too, right? It's so laced with so many different ways to think about it, right? So let's unpack it a teensy little bit. So we would argue as planners, as strategists, as business leaders, we need to be pointing to the future that is quote unquote long-term. So something that's outside of the current moment in business. And that's what you need to do because you're making decisions today that are going to affect the midterm. So you need to have a long-term direction. So what's long-term? So long-term for me would be 3 to 5 years or outside of what you comfortably can see today. And it is incumbent upon us to do that at minimum as a vision. And so a thing that's kind of interesting about that, though, is to say, look, we're trying to point the direction for an organization that is that future state that you want to lead your business to. If you happen to get there in 2 years, good for you. If it takes you 5 years because there was a pandemic, so be it. But maybe that future state is still relevant and maybe it takes longer. So this notion of 5, 3, or whatever is a little arbitrary, honestly. So a vision statement should be that 3 to 5 year statement. And then let's walk it in a little bit. That next layer of your plan might be your strategic goals. Let's agree that those are multi-year in nature, maybe 2, if your vision's like 3 or 5. And then we have our annual OKRs, our goals, our KPIs, the targets we're hitting, and we have our quarterly deliverables, what we're delivering in the quarter for the quarter. So when I think about how far are we planning, I like to think about it in a layered manner because actually each element of your plan should be answering a slightly different type of a time frame. So hopefully that's helpful because that's one of those things that people debate really strongly. And I just want to say one more thing about that, Alex, which is if you are doing something world changing and it might take 15 or 20 years, then your vision might be that far out there. And that's amazing because we need that. And then that's what your time frame is. Totally cool. And then the rest of your plan starts to bring it in a little bit closer.
Erica, one last question. The question we love to end our podcast on with all of our guests. What's your favorite business book and why is it your favorite?
Wow, that's a great question. I have a lot of favorite business books because I think there are so many amazing best practices and great thinkers out there. What I reference all of the time, I will have to say, is Patrick Lencioni's The Advantage. That book is the compilation of all of his best practices, and there's awesome ways to lead conversations like this because ultimately everything we talked about today is about leading a conversation. So that's a book I reference all the time and I recommend to all of my clients because I think there are a lot of really, really good best practices in there that are practical and implementable. And I think Lencioni is a great thinker.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Erica, for joining us. And thank you all for listening to the UpFlip podcast. You can check out more great content over on our YouTube channel, UpFlip on YouTube, or you can head over to our blog, upflip.com/blog, where we've got all sorts of business insights from entrepreneurs and experts across all industries. Once again, Erica J. Olsen, CEO and founder of OnStrategy HQ. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Alex.